All right, so where we left off last week is we left off with King Saul and his the Lord removing his spirit from Saul and pouring it out on the anointed one, David. And so we finished up talking about David being anointed, walking before Samuel, walking before the sons of Jesse and looking at each one. And it wasn't until Samuel had went through all of them, and the Lord had told him that none of these are the ones that he asked if there was another one. And so Jesse brought the youngest out, and Samuel anointed him as the anointed king. And so that's where we left off. And like I said, Saul had an evil spirit come upon him. And as you continue to read chapter 16, it tells us that once we get to chapter 17, that there's already a relationship has started with King Saul and David, because Saul was being tormented with these by this evil spirit, and he was having trouble through the night sleeping. And someone mentioned to him, said, "Hey, David is a great player of the lyre," or we like to call it a harp, but don't know if it was an actual harp as we know it. But anyway, there was something soothing about him, and so him and Saul had developed a relationship, and he really liked him, and so he would bring him into the service to help the king. So David and Samuel already know each other by the time we get to where we're starting at today in chapter 17. So if you want to go ahead and turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17, that's where we'll begin today. So today's lesson is going to kind of be a part one of chapter 17. So the event that we're going to be looking at over the next couple weeks, this event of David's life is probably the one that we know the most. It is most well known because we know that David has this great face-off with this enormous foe. From the eyes of man, it looked like this was an overwhelming foe that maybe couldn't be overcome. And we know this lesson because we've heard it since childhood. It's one of the favorite stories that teachers like to tell, preachers like to preach, and so there's been countless illustrations about this particular passage and chapter that we're going to be covering over the next couple weeks. But there is a question that I want to ask. Is there anything that we can learn from this still? Of course. Of course we can. That was a rhetorical question. I already knew the answer to that. Of course we there's always something we can learn. So today we will begin with verse 1 of chapter 17. And we're going to be reading through verse 11. Now, I done all the reading last week. Why don't somebody help me out and read a little bit today? Do you want to hear that buzzing?
The what?
That's why I ain't got them on.
Oh, I didn't.
Yeah. You can just say you. No, you can. You want me to read the first verse and then you read the rest of them? Okay. All right. I'll read the first verse and you read the next ones there. So now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Sokah, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Sokah and Azekah in Ephes Damim.
Mm-hmm. Set the battle
Thank you. Thank you. Now, the stage has been set for this battle, and it tells us that there were two great armies, that there was the army of Israel, and then there was the army of the Philistines. Now, this was not, they had been fighting with the Philistines for a while before this, so this was not just a new battle that had just sprung up. So the Philistines were there, and they were living in the land. So whenever they had come in and conquered the land and driven out people before them, the Philistines, they were part of the people that were there. And so the Philistines were a pretty heady bunch. They were smart. They were well capable. And they were kind of like, I guess you'd say, well, no, they weren't. The Philistines weren't. But they were kind of like an army, kind of like they were fighting against Israel, kind of like how Israel was fighting against Rome right before Jesus came. They were entwined in great battles for a long time. And so we get to this point. So this is kind of a pinnacle point for the nation of Israel and the Philistines themselves. And so we see one army on one hill, one army on another hill, and there's this great valley in between. And so, they're going to come and they will set forth battle. Now, battle lines at that time were a little bit different than how you see today. I think some movies have probably portrayed them in some ways accurately, in some ways not. But there was a point in time where people start saying, hey, you know what? I don't like running out here. There's a better way to approach this. I can be a little smarter without getting myself killed. But back then, that's how they did battle. But the question I want to ask, and it's that first question in there, humanly speaking, why were the Israelites justly terrified of Goliath? He seems like he's a pretty big fella. So, think of it this way. Today, we look at people, and we see someone, we see like a big lineman, who played professional football. Some of them guys are 6'7", 6'8", 6'9", 300 some pounds. Quite a large individual. Well, imagine seeing this person come through, and like Saul was head and shoulders above the Israelites, well, Goliath was probably a torso and a head above everybody else, because according to the measurements, they said he was about 9.5 feet tall. So you think about that for a moment. 9.5 feet. 9.5 feet would probably be a little taller than where that molding stops. So it would be just a little bit over that. It'd probably be about the height of the top of that speaker. So imagine in a crowd of people, you see this dude coming through there that's that size. Yeah, you're going to take notice. You are going to take notice.
And then all that metal and stuff that he was on.
Yeah. Exactly. So, not only was he enormous, his equipment was enormous. Huh? Yes, because if I can't remember the exact pounds of how much all his armor weighed, but I want to say that when they're talking about the spear. The spearhead itself, I think, is about 100 pounds or something like that. So you can imagine. It's a lot. It's heavy, and that's not something. Imagine grabbing 100 pounds. Because this tells us something about his strength too. Because in battle, if you're throwing something or, trying to slash somebody, you want something that's light but effective. So you've got to think about how strong he was to be able to carry something that he used for battle. And, this was somebody, the Bible tells us that this was somebody who grew up in war. This wasn't his first day on the job. He grew up in war. So he knew how to use this. So if you would think that if there was a better weapon that he could use, he probably would have it. But he's got this enormous spear that he uses for battle, and just part of it weighs around 100 pounds. So you've got to think, not only is he enormous, but his strength has to be unbelievable. Something that we haven't seen on a human scale. Almost divine strength. Almost. So yes, he is an imposing figure. And not only that, he is taunting. He's coming through there and he's taunting the Israelites. Now, not only is he enormous, he's got this armor, but in the way in which he's speaking. He's not speaking as someone who's saying, let's strike a deal and we'll be good to you. This is someone who's, no, so we're going to take care of you and you're going to be our slaves. So not only that, he was very confident, he was very confident in what he was going to be able to achieve against whoever the Israelites chose. So this leads us to the second question. Spiritually speaking, what had the Israelites forgotten about God's covenant promises? He would protect them. So I did put a scripture there that you could go and read because it's important. It's important to read this. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 20. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 1 through 4. Deuteronomy chapter 20, starting with verse 1. Now, this whole chapter is laws about warfare. All right, so God had given them laws about how to approach warfare. So when you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So God is saying, look, when you see this, don't be afraid, for I want you to remember what I brought you out of. Remember the miracles in Egypt. Remember how I led you out of Egypt, brought down the plagues, parted the Red Sea, brought you through that, brought you through the wilderness for all this time, kept you clothed, kept you satisfied. Now, God kept them satisfied, but they weren't satisfied themselves. We know that. But He fed them. They never went thirsty, never went hungry. They had everything they needed. And God had promised them that He was taking them to the land that He had given them. So God had fulfilled every promise that He had said. So He's calling on them in these laws. He's like, when you see this thing and it looks overwhelming, don't worry about it. I got you back. I got you front. I got both sides. I got you covered. Then he says in verse 2, he says, and when you draw near to the battle, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people. Not to the other side, to the Israelite people. He said, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people and shall say to them, hear, O Israel, today you are drawing near for battle against your enemies. Let not your heart faint. Do not fear or panic or be in dread of them. For the Lord your God is He who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you the victory. To give you the victory. All right, so in looking at that question again, spiritually speaking, what have the Israelites forgotten about God's covenant promise? Larry was right on it. God had said, when you face this very thing, because they were looking across there, and they were looking at this imposing army, not just an imposing army, but a very imposing representative for that army. So they're looking at this, and God had told them, said, when you face this situation, I want you to remember this. Remember what I've done for you and what I will give you if you trust me. So do you think there's anything else there that maybe they had lost sight of, or? Taking their eyes off God. Now, I know Judy wasn't here last week, but we're going to come back to it, and we're going to discuss this because I gave you a scripture reference, so you can go back to it. But in question 3, what was the one thing we learned last week from Deuteronomy about the king's spiritual responsibility as a leader to the people and as a representative of God?
Take down the law and read it every day.
Oh, yes. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 18 through 20. Now remember, when we talked about this last week, God had already foretold them that once God had given them everything that they needed, everything that they desired in that land, and they were satisfied, all of a sudden they would be unsatisfied and they would ask for a king besides him. And so God said, okay, in that day, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you this, 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 and this. But he said, here's going to be the requirement. Here's what I'm going to ask. If you desire a king and I give you one, here's what he's supposed to do. This is his responsibility to you as not only a leader of this nation, but as a spiritual representative to you. Because remember, the king was also that spiritual representative. He wasn't just one who walked out and led them in battle, who just made difficult choices. He was a spiritual leader as well. And so as we read that, in verses 18 through 20, it says, and when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priests. Now, why do you think God says that he should write down a copy of that? Yeah. Now, me personally, and I tell people to write stuff down because me personally, when I write things down, write notes or, some kind of, when I'm studying, I say, oh, that's good. And I, make a little note. For I'm preaching or something, I make a little note of something. The reason I do that for myself is because I am more apt to remember it if I write it down myself. But there's another reason for that, is that the scriptures would have been carefully and meticulously made sure that they were correct. Which is why he says, you're going to write this down, but the other thing that's going to be done is that the Levitical priests are going to check it and make sure that it's right. So not only, he can't, this is not something he would be able to do in haste. This is something that he would have had to have taken his time. And he would have been reading along with the scriptures because he had to make a copy of it, so he would have to be reading it as well. And so that's one thing. He had to do that for himself. He had to write a copy of the law. He said, and then it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of his law and these statutes and doing them. So as a king, there was a heavy responsibility placed on the king's shoulder. Not only is he to make a copy of this, but he's supposed to read it every day so that he can learn and live by God's standards. Live according to his will and way so that he wouldn't forget what God had done. Who brought him there? He says that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So there's also a built-in promise there. It's a very similar promise like we see in Revelation. To those who just read this book, there's a blessing. So there's several things there. He's going to learn how to live by God's way. He's going to learn how to be a humble servant leader. Did you catch that? So that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers. See, that's what the Word will do. The Word, if you read it and take it to heart, it'll keep you humble.
It's like Jerry said, keep your eyes on him.
Keep your eye. That's what it does. Keep your heart and your eyes on the Lord. And you can't go wrong. He said, and by doing this, he said, don't, with the Scriptures, do not go to the right hand or to the left hand of the Scriptures. Stay on path with the Scriptures.
And you won't sink.
So today, we have so many people that are floundering. You think probably part of it is because they've kind of went to the left or to the right of where they should be going, staying on the path with the Scriptures. So the king had an enormous weight and an enormous responsibility, but there was a reason for that. He was supposed to be that leader and spiritual representative. So if he was a spiritual representative, then that leads us to the next question of question number 4. Do you think that Saul had fallen short of this because how he handled this as a leader? He absolutely did. Because let's read verse 11 again. All right, well, let's start at verse 10 so we can hear Goliath, and then we'll see how the king, and then we're back in Samuel. We're back in 1 Samuel 17, starting with verse 10. It says, and the Philistine, this is Goliath, said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. All right, so he's saying, look, he's like, I don't care if you bring me from somebody from the front line to the king or anywhere in between. Just bring me somebody I can fight. So he didn't care. He was being disrespectful. He was being very disrespectful to them. So I don't care who you bring, just bring me somebody. I'm going to wipe them out anyway. Just bring me somebody. And so here what happened. It said, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So in question 4, do you think Saul had fallen short of this because he had handled this as a leader? Well, absolutely. Because we read in Deuteronomy 17 and also in Deuteronomy 20. And there's a theme when you start looking at the end of Deuteronomy all the way through the first of Joshua. Because there's something very important happening there. They're ending their journey of wandering and they're going into the promised land. And there are several times, talking about a lot of times, where God utters the phrase, do not be afraid. Be of courage and do not be afraid. He mentions that over and over and over again. Because they were getting ready to face what seemed like impossible odds. Because see, when the Israelites were crossing over the Jordan, which was an obstacle itself, when they crossed the Jordan and they stepped into that first place and they encountered Jericho, and God told them to do something amazing that didn't make sense. But they did it. Not only were they going to face this, but beyond Jericho, they weren't only going to face the Philistines, they were going to face other great armies and peoples. So it wasn't just one. So he's telling them, said, remember this? Remember when I brought you over? And I took care of them and them and them and them and them and them and them? And you got all this, and you are where you are now. Remember all that. Do not be afraid. Be of courage. because it was I who got you here. That's what he's trying to tell them, remind them of. And Saul, evidently, he skipped the part about reading all this and remembering all this.
Here it does too.
Yes, it does. And as I say all the time, who gives us a spirit of fear? It's Satan. It ain't the Lord, because the Word tells us that the Lord did not give us a spirit of fear. It clearly says that. So if He didn't give it to us, then who did? It's the other alternate. It's the other choice. It's Satan. So Saul had fallen short of his responsibility, not only as a human leader or a human king to the people of Israel, but also as their overall spiritual leader. He had failed in that regard. Well, let's carry on. Let's read 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 12 through 27. And if somebody wants to read one part of that, somebody read the other part. If somebody wants to read 12 through 18, somebody read 12 through 18, and then somebody else read 19 to 27.
Now David was the son of an Ammonite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. He had 8 sons. And the man went among men, for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 older sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names were of the 3 sons that went with Jesse were Elab, the firstborn. Next unto him was Abadiah, and the third was Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 elders followed Saul. But David went and returned to Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistines drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren of Ephraim of this parched corn and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brother, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of the 10 of their thousands, and look how the brethren fare, and take their pledge.
All right, somebody start at verse 19. Not all at once.
If I can see this little verse. It says, Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with his keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him, and he came to the trench as the hosts were going forth to fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David led his carriage to the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran unto the army, and came and saluted his brother. And as he talked to them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine guard, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and he spake according to the same words, and David heard them. And all of Israel, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were so totally afraid. And the man of Israel said, Have you seen this man that come up? Surely to defy Israel. It killeth him. The king will enrich him with great riches and give him his daughter, and make his father's house free of Israel. And David spake to the man, stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth the Philistines, and take away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised people answered him after this manner, saying, So it shall be done to the man that killeth him.
All right. Thank you, Larry. As David reaches the army camp, what does he learn about their situation from what we just read?
Dire.
Huh?
It's dire.
It's a dire situation. It's a dire situation now. There's something else we learned there. We learned that they were still fighting. Goliath was still taunting Chance, and did you notice how long he was taunting them?
40 days.
Yeah, and it says he did this morning and evening. So from sun up to sundown, he was taunting them for 40 days. And that number 40 comes up a lot in the Bible.
It does.
And so there he is. There's this great giant, amongst the people, fighting amongst themselves, but here he is taunting them day after day. And David had been back and forth. The scripture tells us that David had been back and forth to the lines to at least, bring some stuff to the camp, to his brothers, to give reports. And so, we see Saul using him, and we see things going on like that. Well, it just so happens that on one day at the same time when Goliath had decided to come out and start utter these words, David just happened to be there to hear him. And so he hears this. He hears this man. And there's something that David says here.
Last sentence in verse 26. That he should defy the armies of the living God.
That's the last question of today, so I'm going to hold off on that one because I want to come back to it. But David is asking some important questions. Nobody else was asking these questions. Saul should have been out there because he was not only their human leader. Kings actually went out and fought. They were the head of the army. So they went out and fight. They would fight. And so Saul should have been the one who was taking care of this, but he wasn't.
Like today.
Well, yeah, he was employing today's standards, wasn't he? But, David asked him a question. He said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. Now, that's what the men said. I didn't see Saul say that. That's what the men were saying. So I don't know if the men were trying to entice somebody to, hey, I triple dog dare you, go and take him on, because there's always somebody in the bunch that's always provoking somebody. Hey, won't you go do this?
But the Lord was working on David all the time.
Oh, he was working. Now, was it any coincidence that David had just happened to show up at that time?
No, it was
No.
It was God's will.
After 40 days and 40 nights of all this going on, do you think it was any coincidence that God let him hear that day? Oh no. God was working.
That's right.
God was working on David. Now we got to remember David was no slouch. He was a shepherd. He was the keeper of the sheep. So, there was a lot more wild beasts roaming around Israel than there are today.
They had responsibility.
They had some heavy responsibilities. So David learns a lot about their situation. David learns about how the army, how they feel about the situation. Not only that, I imagine David's probably getting a good idea in his mind of how the king's handling this situation. You know, he's going and he's speaking with the captains. He's speaking with the leaders. So I would imagine that as David is taking these, you know, going through these tasks of taking these things to these different leaders, because remember, he was also Saul's armor bearer. So he would have been listening to Saul. He would have been in contact with his commanders and the captains of the different divisions.
The troops were grumbling.
Right. So David was hearing all of this. See, it may not tell us that, but it does tell us he was in contact with them people. So you know when you come in contact with people, you hear things. You see things. So don't you think David was seeing the unrest? But the thing that got him the most was what he heard when Goliath spoke. And then he heard how the men responded. He heard how Saul responded. So he took all that in.
Don't you think it hurt David to hear Goliath mocking God?
Sure it did, because that's what he asked there.
Yeah.
That's what he asked there in verse 26. That's what he asked in verse 26. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that defied the armies of the living God? So let's read verses 28 through 30. It says, Now Eliab his eldest brother heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, Well, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. So in question 6, why do you think David's brother is so harsh with him?
David looking for glory.
Well, that's probably what they were thinking. You know, here's big brother listening to little brother. You know, I imagine his behind's probably already chapped a little bit that he was not the chosen one. You know, when Samuel came and anointed David. Yeah, I'm sure it did. It hurt his feelings. And so you've got the 3 eldest brothers. And so I imagine they're all probably upset at David. Didn't we see a similar situation like that earlier on in the Bible? Yeah, somebody got put down a well. Remember that? And sent to slavery, sold to merchants heading to Egypt. So we've seen this play out before, where people can get their feelings hurt. They've got an ego. You know, what was the thing that they weren't thinking about? What was the thing that they weren't relying on?
God get the glory.
All right, God getting the glory, but who had chosen David? God did.
God.
Okay, so as God's representative, Samuel was going through the line, and God was telling him, this is not the one, this is not the one, this is not the one, through 6 others, and then finally get to David. This is the one.
Yeah.
Yes. Jealousy, ego, pride. You know, they probably would have felt like we're the most capable.
And then the oldest got passed over.
Exactly.
Jealousy.
So, you know, we've seen that play out before. Here it is playing out again. So his brother is very harsh with him. See, David's coming to bring him some goodies. He said, you're out here fighting. I come to bring you some goodwill and some fresh food. And so while this is happening, David overhears this taunt by Goliath that had been going on for 40 days. And David finally heard it while he was there. And so David is asking a question, well, if ain't nobody else going to ask it, I am. So was it presumption on his part that, you know, David was asking a question maybe he shouldn't have been asking, or was there something more at play there? I think there was something more at play, the reason why David asked that. And his brothers didn't like it. But notice the men, after David had asked this question, the men said, "Oh yeah, the king will do that. The king will do that for you." Which brings me to that last question. David asked the question, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Are there times when we should be asking a similar question about current threats to the church? Because what do we see today? Think about the church as a whole, and think about what have you seen in the way church leaders are leading their churches in the culture war.
They're letting the world creep in.
They're letting the world. They're examining the world, and they're wanting to live.
Get their eyes off the Lord.
Exactly. I think a lot of times, now this is me, and I think maybe we talked a little bit about this last week, but I think a lot of times we kind of focus on that a little bit differently than maybe some people do. Some people say, well, some people will say, well, if you're not dressing appropriately, then you're siding with culture. Well, that's just not true. That's something we invented. That's not true. I'm sure probably Terry, Fred, and Larry, y'all could probably say that, y'all can probably remember, back a long time ago when, Quakers probably held more onto that simple dress of black and white, just a simple dress. Right, well, look, hey, there's still, the reason I asked this because I know that y'all have been of the Quaker persuasion. Well, the reason I ask that is because in your lifetime there are churches and Quakers who still held on to that. That's the reason I asked that.
Not even the friends. Growing up and everything, everybody that came to church wore suits. All the women wore dresses.
Yeah.
Still ladies in suits.
Yeah.
Look at Wayne Sunday.
Yeah.
He ain't gonna change.
Yeah.
Wayne's not gonna change.
Now, I'm not saying that if you come to church in a suit, I'm not saying that's wrong. If you want to wear a suit and come that's fine.
Whatever you wanna do.
But is that how God addresses us? Is that how God cares? No, it's not.
He looks at the heart.
That's something we learned last week, right, in our lesson. We equate dress with culture. That somehow if we don't dress in our fine threads, that somehow we're bringing culture into the church. Well, that's not true. If you read the scriptures, it was always about simplicity. It was about being simple. The other thing, like with music or with worship, some people prefer pews, some people prefer chairs. What are we missing? Is it about the pews? Is it about the chairs? The thing that a lot of people are missing is those things are fine if that's where you're going, but those things don't have the temperature of what's going on in the church. This right here, this is what matters right here. This. If you get away from this, then you've lost it. Because there's a lot of places that they're finely dressed. According to some people's standards, they play the right music. They read the right version of the Bible. But they don't adhere to this. There's several of them in Asheboro where I live. Got large congregations. And they have a homosexual as a pastor. But they dress fine, they stick to the hymns, and they read the old King James. You can't tell me. So, there's plenty of examples. There's plenty of examples. See, it's not about those standards. It's about the standard of the Word of God, living by the Word of God, leaders preaching the Word of God, being an example of the Word of God. Those are the things that matter. I think sometimes we forget those things. And so I think, the reason I asked that question is, should leaders in our churches, and not just leaders, but I mean just Christians in general, should we not be asking kind of that same question that David was about what we see maybe in the church at times, or especially outside? Who is this? Like with when the COVID thing come around, they wanted to shut down the churches. There wasn't a whole lot of people that were saying, well, who are you? Who are you to tell us, to try and take something from us that is a God-given right? I mean, regardless of whether it says it in the Constitution or not, or the Declaration of Independence, that's a man's right. That is a man's right to either worship God or not worship God. That is a right that is given to him by us. So who are they to say, no, you can't do that? See, there were a lot of people who were fine. A lot of people were perfectly fine saying, yeah, we'll shut down. We won't even have church. We can just whatever. A lot of people were fine with that. They were not going to fight against that at all. So you can kind of take the temperature of the room there. I am thankful that we did have some sheriffs in our county and in other counties who said if the governor or the state legislature puts that some kind of not a law, because it's not a law, some kind of procedure or something in place that we had to follow, they said, look, we're not going to follow this. We're not going to arrest anybody who breaks it. We're just not going to. So I'm thankful that we did have some leaders who said, you know what? They knew what was right.
Amen.
But how many people in churches are willing to stand up and say the thing that David did? Maybe not the exact words, but who is this to defy God? Who are these godless people to tell us that we have to defy God? I don't think there's enough of us asking that question today. I do think that I have seen more coming out of the woodworks here lately. So I'm happy for that. But that's a question I want you to ponder, because like I said, this was kind of a part 2 of chapter 17, because we're going to get back to the meat and taters of this next week, where we actually see the battle, and we see the other things that David says, and some other things that we should think about. But just remember that last question. Should we be asking that question in the church today? Any other questions or comments today? Anything that you observed or noticed?
Well, about this COVID thing it's about who you put your trust in.
Yep. Yep.
If you put your trust in God, you're gonna be all right.
Yep.
And it's no use being afraid. I mean,
Yep.
I think, me and my wife, we got the shots. We got 2 shots. But if I had to do over, I never took them 2 shots. I would never took 2 shots, and I never paid no attention to what went on the media.
Yeah. Well, I mean, unfortunately, it's funny. You're starting to see even the liberal media.
It's all a lie.
It's
all a lie.
even
It's all propaganda.
Well,
Trying to make you scared.
I told you
And
that.
control.
I told you that from day one.
I know.
I told everybody that from day one.
I know.
I'm not Nostradamus, but I mean,
You're not even close.
I told you what was happening when it was happening.
Yeah, I know it.
Thought she was the biggest liar there ever was.
But anyway, I mean, that was a point in time when people should have, church people, I mean, look, like I've always said, the world is going to be the world.
That's right.
I mean, the world has been the world since sin came into the world. So people are going to act like that. But Christians, Christians need to be acting like Christians.
But I've known so many people that took that shot
That's it.
and killed them, or they got sick, or didn't get over it. They're still
In trouble.
suffering for it.
We got a friend like that.
Yeah. And I know a lot too. And, it's, what is done is done.
Yeah.
So, but, as Christians, the main thing is that we don't be like Saul. Saul took his eyes off of God. Saul had forgotten, and apparently maybe his priest did too, they had forgotten who was fighting for them. And they forgot who they need to put their trust in. And so that same thing applies to us today. When we're faced with something big, and this is a lesson we'll get to next week, when we're faced with something that looks like an overwhelming foe across the valley, who are we going to put our trust in? Something for y'all to think about this week. Y'all go ahead and finish reading chapter 17. Go ahead and read ahead a little bit. Get yourself familiar with what we're doing. But y'all, anything else? Any other comments?
Go and get supper tonight.
Yes. Supper tonight. Hot dogs. Yep. All right. We have nothing else. Ronnie, would you close us out in prayer today?